So why don't we go ahead and kick off our webinar. I'm delighted to have three distinguished panelists to speak with us today regarding the latest SIA report, the 2020 State of the U.S. Semiconductor Industry. My name is Falan Yanug. I'm the Director for Industry Statistics and Economic Policy at the Semiconductor Industry Association. And I'll be hosting the event, and we'll go through and really delighted to have folks, our three distinguished panelists speak. The way we'll work it is I'll go ahead and provide some overview slides about what's in the report in terms of both the market, where the U.S. industry fits in the market, competitive issues going forward for the U.S. industry, and also obviously the policy landscape, how it's affecting the U.S. industry. So with that, let me go ahead and quickly introduce our three panelists. We have John Pitzer from Credit Suisse, Managing Director. We also have Dan Hutchison, who is the CEO and Chairman of VLSI Research. And finally, Stephen Ezell, Vice President, Global Innovation Policy for the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. We look forward to hearing your remarks. But why don't we go ahead and I'll go ahead and just give you a quick level set of what the report has to say. Let me give me a second here, and I will get the slideshow. So this report, which is available on the SIA website, is an effort to sort of provide a view of where the U.S. industry stands currently and what are the looming challenges ahead and the opportunities, frankly, as well for the U.S. semiconductor industry. And we look at through a number of lenses, one being the size and the state of the actual market and demand. Then, of course, where the U.S. industry has its strengths and weaknesses in terms of its competitiveness position, manufacturing, workforce, all those components of the actual industry that keeps it competitive and maintains market share. And then finally, of course, we have to discuss what the policy landscape looks like and how it's impacting the industry. And there's a lot to talk about in that. So we'll go ahead and get started. So first of all, just to provide an overview of where the market is, this provides a 20-year annual sales for the global market. I think the main takeaway here is obviously it's good that the industry is sort of moving up and to the right, and that's where we hope that the industry continues moving. Obviously, there's a lot of cyclicality in the industry. It's sort of obviously a cliche that the global semiconductor industry is highly cyclical, but I think the key is over the long term whether we can see growth moving forward over the long term. And I know last year we reached a record of 469 billion total market size, and this year a little down, back to 412. So looking forward to the long-term growth, moving back up is, I think, will be key. Now, in terms of where the growth is coming from, both communication and computer end use sales account basically for about 2/3 of all semiconductor sales currently. Though automotive and industrial have been increasing growth drivers, while not as big currently as computer and communication. And of course, we have other growth drivers that sort of long-term growth drivers that hopefully will sustain growth. We talk about 5G implementation, IoT, exascale computing. I think the picture is quite positive, and we'll obviously get more thoughts on this from John Pitzer. But had you told me, 2 or 3 years ago that we'd be soon approaching a $500 billion global market, I would have been a bit skeptical. But we are getting there, and I would assume in the long term we'll eventually get to that and surpass that point. Now, in terms of U.S. industry market share, we're currently in 2019, the U.S. semiconductor industry was at 47% global sales market share, the industry leader. And this is sort of the position that the industry has been in since about the mid to late 1990s, give or take, plus or 5% around the 50% mark. So this is obviously good news. I guess the question is trends going forward. Can the U.S. industry sustain this market leadership, sales market leadership? Certainly, The other industries, countries' industries indicated below are highly competitive, putting out highly competitive products and very innovative. It'll be a challenge certainly to maintain this. One thing that I highlight on the right, the report highlights on the right side graphic, is the advantage that the global leader does have in terms of maintaining innovation competitiveness. With high sales and market leadership comes the ability to reinvest higher levels back into R&D. The industry obviously is R&D intensive. It's innovation focused. So plowing money back, being able to plow more money back into R&D helps to sustain the industry's medium and even long-term success and market share leadership by creating more and new innovative products. So this is a distinct advantage that the U.S. industry currently enjoys, and hopefully can enjoy going forward. Now, in terms of the U.S. industry's position, again, this is one of its strengths that we've seen, the ability to reinvest high levels of absolute dollars back into R&D. This graph just shows how the absolute dollar amounts in billions reinvested by the U.S. semiconductor industry over the past 20 years. In 2019, the amount was close to 40 billion, which when you compare to other U.S. industries is at the top, if not very top. We usually are neck and neck with the pharmaceutical industry in terms of R&D as a percent of sales that's reinvested into the industry. So it's highly R&D intensive. And also when you compare the US semiconductor industry's R&D as a percent of sales rate to other countries' semiconductor industries, it is also tends to be higher. So this is all good news in terms of things that the US industry has been able to do to ensure the best can long-term leadership. However, as the report highlights, there are challenges. This shows the years behind the leader in terms of logic manufacturing technology. And currently, whereas a few years ago, the U.S. was solidly, 2 plus years ahead of its competitors. Right now, we're sort of not ahead at all, and sort of on par with the Taiwanese and the Korean semiconductor industries. So this is a challenge, something that if this trend continues, obviously the purple line will soon be not in a leadership position in terms of the manufacturing position. Also, in terms of manufacturing, some other numbers that are presented in the report, again, comparing the U.S. semiconductor industry with other U.S. industries, highly capital intensive, one of the second highest in terms of capital investment as a percent of sales, or CapEx in terms of sales. And in terms of other global competitors, again, the U.S. invests highly in CapEx. It was second to the Korean semiconductor industry last year. So it has a strong manufacturing base globally. It is global in terms of the U.S. Footprint in terms of manufacturing. If you look on the left-hand slide here, the wafer capacity by location. Again, for the U.S. industry, the U.S. is the single leading location for U.S. industry capacity, but it is also pretty diverse in terms of where the U.S. industry has decided to do its manufacturing: Singapore, Taiwan, Europe, Japan, so on and so forth. There is a question, though, given, again, looking not just at a snapshot of the current year, but in terms of trends, how much installed capacity is in the U.S. currently, and how much of that what that share of global capacity will be going forward. Currently, the amount of installed capacity in the U.S. Compared to globally is about 12.5%. Now this, if you compare to many years ago, I think it was close to 40% at the start of the 1990s. So there's been a long-term erosion of the share of capacity in the U.S. Versus globally, and that's just because a lot of the added capacity has been added in Asia, as you can see in the graph to the right. But in terms of the estimates, if this trend continues over the next 10 years, we're looking at around 10% of total global manufacturing being done in the U.S. Want to touch upon also the importance of workforce and what the U.S. semiconductor industry adds to the domestic workforce. It accounts for about about 250,000 direct jobs in the U.S. And also about 4.89 indirect jobs, or jobs that are created indirectly because of either of jobs that need to supply the industry with equipment and materials, or because of the respending that semiconductor workers perform in their local economies. So this is a source of solid jobs throughout the United States. Our footprint it's not everywhere in the United States, but it is in a number of states that folks may not realize. Idaho, for example, North Carolina, Maine. So it's a diverse footprint in terms of where the manufacturing is done, and is a source of strong jobs in those localities. Finally, just want to touch upon again the policy landscape. A lot of things have been going on in terms of policy that has affected the U.S. semiconductor industry over the past few years. In terms of the SIA policy priorities, certainly funding for pre-competitive domestic semiconductor research has been a perennial policy priority, as well as free and open markets. Our industry, the sales for our products are usually perennially around 80+% more abroad than domestically. So it's a domestic market, it's an international market for our products. Our global supply chain, the US industry takes advantage of those quite heavily. So free and open markets are very key. And then of course, we're also focused on workforce development as the lifeblood of the industry, and domestic manufacturing as well. So we'll get into more of that in our discussion. But why don't we go ahead and turn to to our presenters. And I'd like to start off with you, John Pitzer from Credit Suisse. And if you could give us your thoughts on sort of the direction long-term of the global market and where the U.S. industry fits in that.
Yeah, appreciate it, Falon. I wanted to thank you for the opportunity to speak this morning, and to thank everyone online for attending. I wanted to try to keep my prepared comments relatively brief and save as much time for the other speakers, but more importantly, the Q&A, because I always find that to be the more interesting part of these presentations. But I did want to hit on sort of 2 or 3 key issues today. First, walk through kind of our view of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the semi industry, both this year and next. Second, and probably most importantly, and straight to your question, Falon, is to walk through kind of our long-term view of growth in the industry. And it's really an argument that suggests that we are just in the early innings of seeing what we think is going to be a significant value transfer out of traditional industries back into silicon, which we believe will let the long-term CAGR of this industry, which has been around 3 to 5%, accelerate to at least 6 to 8, with actual potential upside to 9 to 12. And then lastly, briefly touch upon kind of the Wall Street perspective on US-China tensions and the impact it's likely to have on the US semi industry. First, just kind of hitting on COVID, as you pointed out in your presentation, Falon, that this industry is notoriously cyclical. And so there's a lot of history that we can try to leverage off of to try to understand what's happening in the current environment. And I do think a lot of people initially kind of went back to the global financial crisis of 2008 to think about how the COVID pandemic might impact kind of 2019 and 2020 semi-industry revenue. I think that's a good starting place, but I think it's also really important to realize that there are significant differences between that environment and this environment. Probably the most important and most germane to semis is that we went into the 08-09 global financial crisis relatively hot. Inventory levels were relatively high. Growth rates heading into that event for the industry were relatively high. In stark contrast, 2019 was really a year where semis undershipped end demand. And so we came into the COVID crisis with relatively lean inventories. And given the fact that COVID was both a supply shock and a demand shock, those low inventory levels have given OEMs sort of the incentive to want to build inventory, at least in the near term. And we always thought that inventory would help both the March quarter and the June quarter for most US public companies. Our initial view was that perhaps by the time we got to September, that inventory cushion would be over and we'd see the full force of the demand shock from COVID. We're modifying that view because clearly I think that our bottoms up checks would suggest that OEMs are continuing to willing to build inventory into the calendar third quarter, whether that's the result of US-China tensions on the rise or fear that COVID might reemerge sometime in the fall and winter. OEMs are willing to protect their supply chains right now as it stands. I think the other sort of big difference between now and sort of the global financial crisis is the GFC hit every region, every end market at the same time. And what we're seeing with COVID is a very uneven impact from the pandemic. And in fact, when you look at dynamics like work from home, school from home, online everything, COVID has initially driven sort of, if not a pull forward, and at least acceleration in some parts of the semi market. In fact, if you look at the data that you guys published over the weekend, year to date, if you look at MPU sales, they're up over 20%. That's in stark contrast to things like analog and MCU, which are still down about 6% year to date. But I think that's a big difference. And it plays into the fact that when you go back to the 08, 09 financial crisis, I love using this stat, AWS at that point was a whopping $131 million in revenue in 2008. They're likely to be at or slightly above $45 billion in 2020. And so the whole cloud business model was just in its infancy during the global financial crisis. What's different this time is that's now a meaningful part of end demand when it comes to semis. The last, and I think probably most significant difference between this environment and the global financial crisis is really the magnitude and velocity of both the monetary and fiscal response out of world governments. And I'll take a look at just kind of what the US has done. But if you look at it on a percent of US GDP, during the 9/11 crisis, the fiscal and monetary policy added up to about 3% of annual GDP, and it took 24 months to inject that into the economy. If you look at the global financial crisis, it was about 15% of annualized US GDP, and it took about a year for policymakers to get that stimulus into the economy. Over a 22-day period in the midst of the COVID pandemic, you saw a 30% injection of US GDP in the form of fiscal and monetary response, which is just unprecedented. And it's actually leading to a better demand background than I think we would have had otherwise. I think when you pull that all together, we came into this year thinking that the semi industry would grow about 7% in 2020. That was off of a base of a decline of about 12 last year. Our initial sort of knee-jerk stress test as COVID started to unfold was that we would have to rethink about our growth rate and assume sort of a contraction of maybe down 5 to 10%. We're needing to adjust that view because year to date, semi revenues are actually up 6%. If you have a flat half on half, we'll get about 2% growth for the overall year. And my guess is we're going to do a little bit better than flat half on half. And so we're talking about an industry that probably is flat to up slightly this year. I think the more important argument is when you look out to 2021, we had been carrying a number absolutely of about $470 billion. So slightly above kind of the peak that we saw back in 2018. I don't think I necessarily have to change that number. And I think that's one of the unique characteristics about the semiconductor industry as it pertains to COVID-19. There's nothing really structural about COVID that changes the long-term demand trends for silicon. And in fact, you can actually make the argument with things like work from home, school from home, online, everything, that COVID's actually codifying a lot of the secular tailwinds that we've been talking about driving growth in the industry. And in fact, we'll talk about in the next part of my presentation, this idea of a value transfer. We think that the mechanism for that mainly is going to be the data economy, but you can make an argument that COVID is another one of those drivers that's driving value out of traditional industries back into silicon. I think this is a great example. I'm probably going to spend significantly less time on airplanes going forward post-COVID than I did pre-COVID, but that means a lot more video conferencing. That's a good sort of exchange for semis. A lot more semis go into doing what we're doing right now than flying on an airplane. So as a result, I don't see why we have to change that 470 billion number all that much for next year. Maybe because of our starting point, it looks more like 460, 465, but that would imply a revenue growth year for 2021 that's low double digits to mid-teens, somewhere in that range. And I still feel pretty good that that's the right way to think about it. More importantly, the second part of my presentation is really kind of our view that the long-term growth rate in the semi industry is poised to accelerate. And there's two big concepts that we're trying to get across. The first is, if you look out over the last 20 years, the semi industry has actually done a horrendous job capturing value in the economy. If you look at the period between 1995 and 2015, and you look at semiconductor revenue as a percent of global nominal GDP, it was mostly unchanged, which if you think about it is kind of an astounding feat, because silicon was so much more pervasive in our lives in 2015 versus 1995. Yet despite that, the industry didn't grow in line with nominal GDP. I think the real driver of that was three things. One, in the late 90s, barriers to entry for this industry came down with the advent of the foundry model. And in conjunction with that, we just saw that it was easier to be a chip company. We saw a lot more new company formation and IPOs. Secondly, we saw supply growth accelerate on multiple vectors starting in the late 90s. Moore's Law became a little bit easier. Instead of a 3.5-year sort of cadence, it dropped to a 2.5 to 3-year cadence. And then with the advent of 300 millimeter, supply growth accelerated even further. And then lastly, on the demand side, you saw a real consumerization of the demand curve for semis. And the net result was an industry that historically always saw ASPs go up in the tune of 3 to 5%, which, by the way, I think is the biggest misperception, at least on Wall Street, around this industry. Investors tend to view semis as being naturally price deflationary. They're actually not. The first 30 years of the industry, ASPs went up, but in an environment where competition was growing, supply growth was accelerating, and the demand curve was becoming much more heavily consumerized, management teams actually pulled the price elasticity button to see what would happen. And what happened is we undergrew the economy. What we feel very optimistic about, really starting around 2014, 2015, all three of those dynamics have started to reverse. Barriers to entry are now absolutely going up, and it talks exactly to a point that you made earlier, and that's the R&D intensity of this industry. TSMC, UMC, SMIC solved the capital scale issue for semiconductor companies. You went fabless. What was interesting in our mind in around 2010, 2011, it was the first year ever the industry actually spent more on R&D than it did on CapEx. And so there was this R&D scale burden that meant even if you were fabless, you had to be big. And the net result with that was lack of new company formation and a heck of a lot of M&A. If you go back since the financial crisis, there's been 250 plus mergers in the semi industry for a nominal value of about $500 billion. So barriers to entry are going up instead of going down. Supply growth is absolutely slowing. Moore's Law is becoming more difficult. Dan, as we talked about in the preamble, 450 was the next wafer size transition that was supposed to save the industry from an economic standpoint. I'm sure Dan will touch upon that in his presentation. It ain't happening. And so we're in a much healthier supply environment for semis. And then lastly, with handsets now fully penetrated and with the advent of cloud and industrial and 5G infrastructure, you're starting to see the demand curve mix back to sort of non-consumer areas. And what we think that's going to lead to is a pricing power shifting back into semis. And what we've seen in the data is we've gone from a declining price curve of about 3 to 5% to what's been sort of a flattish price curve ex memory in recent years. We actually think there's an opportunity for ASPs to start to rise. The last point, guys, did you lose me? Can you hear me, guys? Something just happened on my end.
We can hear you, but we can't see your video.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Hold on one second, see if this works any better. Hopefully, okay, I'm back.
Yeah, you're back.
The second angle of this is I think I get this 3 to 5 going to 6 to 8% CAGR, even without using all the buzzwords that we like to use, like autonomous driving and machine learning and AI and IoT. I think this whole move to a data economy is an accelerant on top of this thesis. And I think investors woefully underappreciate semiconductors' leverage to this move to a data economy. And as we think about sort of data and the data economy, as it pertains to semis, we always talk about 4 buckets. You've got to create data, you've got to store it, you've got to move it across the network, and you've got to analyze it. Clearly analytics is the most important bucket, because if you can't do that, you can't monetize. And if you can't monetize, there's really no business model around data. The good thing is the monetization scheme around data is becoming significantly more efficient. And this is where I think we're still a little bit differentiated relative to some of our peers. It's an observation that if you look at those first 3 buckets of create, store, and transmit, they've always benefited from non-linear cost declines through the digital age. Every year it's cheaper to make a bit, every year it's cheaper to store it, every year it's cheaper to actually move it across the network. And my observation for having done this for 20 plus years is you make something cheaper and people a lot smarter than me are going to come up with new use cases that always tend to grow the market to be significantly larger than people think at inception. The problem with this dynamic is up until recently, that analytics bucket has only seen cost go up. And the reason for that is up until recently, if we wanted to analyze data, we had to structure it. And most of the data that we create is unstructured. And the cost of taking unstructured data and cleaning it up is cost prohibitive. It's one of the reasons why we analyze less than 2% of the data that the world creates. I mean, we've been growing data at a 50% CAGR, but we really haven't been, most of it's dark data. This is where AI becomes a really interesting technology for us, because in our view, the hypothesis is AI becomes the first technology that systematically starts to bring down the cost of analytics. And if we're right, as the cost of analytics come down, you're going to see an explosion of new use cases that's going to drive the market to be significantly larger than people think at inception. And to be clear, investors in the public market are very bullish about the AI opportunity. I still think they're underestimating. And one way that we try to size up this market is if you think about AI as a technology that corporations want to deploy to be more efficient, there's 3 big areas that every CEO wants to be more efficient in: their cost of goods, their OpEx, and their CapEx. And so I had my team put together sort of a model of what the global size of the market is for COGS, OpEx, and CapEx with public companies out there on an industry by industry basis. When you add it all up, the world spends about $43 trillion a year on those 3 buckets of expense. If in this move to a data economy, the semi industry can capture just 1% of that value, that's another $430 billion of potential revenue for the industry, which is about $450 billion today. So it's effectively a doubling. And it's that sort of move to a data-driven economy that we think adds the potential upside for that 6 to 8% long-term CAGR, moving to sort of high single digits, low double digits. You know, you are marveling at the industry being a $500 billion industry. I'm hoping in my investment lifetime, in the next 3 to 5 years, we'll be talking about $750 billion as the right target for the industry.
Right.
The last quick point I'll make is just on US-China, because I think Stephen probably has much more insight than I do, but I'll kind of give you the Wall Street perspective. And that is, I think public investors have been way too much focused on a single dimension of the US-China trade or relations issues. And that is punitively what the US might do to either slow or stop China's progress or Huawei's progress. And when you think about US-China, I think you've got to think about, you know, the US policy towards Huawei and the US policy towards China's semis, because at least to date, it's been very different. And I think that's an important dimension to think about. But quite frankly, I think what most investors have missed is that the US is not only going to try to stop China's progress in certain areas, they're also going to really try to accelerate our own domestic capabilities. You know, we've been very vocal for many years talking about the need to have domestic leading edge manufacturing capacity. It's nice to be vindicated a little bit with the TSMC Arizona announcement, and also some of the bills that are now potentially coming out of Washington for R&D support. The other one I think investors are going to be surprised about is the growing bipartisan sort of agreement around just a very large 5G broadband infrastructure bill. I think people are going to be surprised by how aggressive the US is likely to be in the coming years to try to support that. And quite frankly, you know, one of the things we've been arguing about COVID and what a post-COVID world might look like, in our view, the most enduring impact of COVID is going to be a major rethink of global supply chains. And our hypothesis is very straightforward. Supply chains are going to become slightly more redundant, slightly more sovereign. And as a result, they're going to need to become more automated and more intelligent. And I think a lot of investors don't realize that you can't really have an intelligent manufacturing industry without a 5G backbone. And so I would suspect maybe not before the elections, because we're getting into that gray area where Democrats don't want to give Republicans an edge and Republicans don't want to give Democrats an edge. But I think as we think out over the next 3 to 5 years, people will be surprised by how supportive the US government is going to be on a 5G broadband bill. And with that, Falon, I'll turn it back to you so you can introduce Dan and move on.
Great. Well, appreciate that overview of your thoughts on where the market is heading. I think my takeaway is we got some big opportunities in terms of where the market's going. You said 750. This is being recorded. So, but no, in all seriousness, I think turning to you, Dan, big opportunities. Question for me when I look at these opportunities is how well positioned is the U.S. semiconductor industry to take advantage of those opportunities? I think that's sort of the question we're all thinking about. I mentioned we're at 47% global sales market share. Can we maintain that level of leadership that we have over the past 20 plus years going forward?
Thank you, Fallon. I'd also like to thank the SIA for publishing what is truly a groundbreaking report. It really covers the big opportunities and looming challenges that we're looking at today and that face the semiconductor industry. I got a lot out of it. Now, let me say that the state of the industry remains strong, and that's been even made stronger with the challenge the coronavirus has brought to the world's economy. Stronger due to the unprecedented demand the work-at-home economy, or WAHE, as I like to call it, has brought. Now, in fact, the world's economy was saved by the fruits of innovation the semiconductor industry has brought over the last 7 decades of its existence. And, in fact, a lot of analysts like to run home to monitor the last down cycle, which is 2008. I actually think that the post-COVID era is going to look more like the post-World War II era. And I think that's a better metaphor in terms of, because, we're going to be in the post-early internet era. So anyway, today the semiconductor industry has rarely been stronger. The United States semiconductor industry is an undisputed technology leader in advanced semiconductor design. And this includes the tools needed to make artificial intelligence, cloud, self-driving vehicles possible. And America has dominant market shares in microprocessors, graphic chips, and programmable logic. The US is also well positioned in critical designs of 5G related semiconductors with leading positions in chips that enable wireless communications, network management, and data storage. Plus, American firms are leading efforts to develop new segments such as advanced image sensors, unstructured data processor core, and onboard radar. Add to this the big opportunities the coronavirus has brought with the need for innovation in faster networks, data center traffic, to enable the WAHE, or work-at-home economy. That John talked about, to accomplish this today, the most advanced ICs for leading edge logic application use 10/7 nanometer technology. And they pack over 20 billion transistors on a chip, which is, an amazing number when you think about it. But to put all that in perspective, the tolerances needed to make today's chips are roughly about 1/10 or smaller the size of a coronavirus. And despite all of the fake news about the death of Moore's Law at 28 nanometer, we actually passed that years ago, and 3 nanometer is well on its way to being realized with visibility beyond that. Now, major developments in EUV, etch, and deposition have really made this possible. Much of this has been done by Americans, but also European, Japanese, Korean, and Taiwanese have contributed. And this really reflects the global nature of the semiconductor industry. Now, American companies led in material system engineering breakthroughs that really improved device performance. They lowered power consumption, and we shrank area, and even lowered cost. Now, this is known as the PPAC goal, and it was originally codified in what everyone calls Moore's Law. Now, the challenge is funding this innovation. And the challenge is visible in the decline from almost 30 companies manufacturing integrated circuits at the leading edge 20 years ago, to only 5 today. And as recently as 5 years ago, 5 were in America. But today, America's semiconductor industry only has 1 logic, and one memory chip maker at the leading edge. Worse, the 2-year lead held in advanced logic 10 years ago has vanished. And in 2019, the United States was essentially neck and neck in logic process technology as Korea and Taiwan raced with America to bring leading edge technology to market. Given the criticality of advanced semiconductor manufacturing technology, America must make some significant investments to strengthen its global position. And this is despite the fact that American companies spent 4 times more in R&D last year than they did 20 years ago. So while America holds 61% of the logic IC market, which are critical WAHE components, and around 90% of advanced logic, more than 80% of these chips are made outside the United States, mostly in Taiwan, Korea, and China is emerging with a tailwind of billions and billions of yuan. Now, why isn't China investing so much? One big reason is 5G, which we talked about, John talked about earlier, which is the most hotly contested area in communications today. Its greater speed and bandwidth will be critical to building and enabling the infrastructure that autonomous vehicles and smart cities need. And someday in the future, this infrastructure will cause people to look back at today's cities and see them like we see the horse and buggy cities of more than a century ago. At the heart of this are advanced semiconductors critical for 5G's deployment because they enable the radios that transmit the signals, the devices that connect the network, and the backbone networks that carry all the data. Here, American companies hold a leadership position in semiconductors while political and regulatory uncertainties threaten their competitive position. America can't afford to fall behind in this global race. Turning to workforce, America's lead in semiconductors is highly dependent on 2 critical factors. First, we already talked about, which is being able to invest in advanced semiconductor design and manufacturing. And second, actually really I would say first, is having a competitive workforce to realize those investments in product, which is GDP when you think about it. America's total CapEx investment was second only to Korea in 2019. And the United States is spending for plant and equipment to manufacture advanced logic, where it led and it accounted actually for 40% of the total last year. Now one might ask, why spend all this when everything's in Asia? But this is the wrong question to ask because the volume of manufacturing in the United States hasn't changed much over 20 years and is actually very stable. It's that the growth has been in Asia. Now, key reason for this stability is America's secret advantage, and that is an ability to attract some of the world's most talented people to study at American universities. This can be seen in how semiconductor manufacturing is spread across 18 states, all are near education centers of excellence, as well as in the recent trend of Asian companies to manufacture in the United States. Students from all over the globe come to study here and want to stay here. We just need to keep them here. Now, having access to a highly educated workforce that's strong in STEM is critical to the future of America's leadership in semiconductors. And we need a lot of those people. As Fallon pointed out, semiconductor industry is directly responsible for 250,000 jobs in the United States today. And each one of these supports about 5 more jobs, which means that well over 1 million jobs in the United States come from the semiconductor industry. Moreover, just think about how many jobs would be here if what went to Asia doesn't stay in Asia. America's semiconductor industry can play a critical role in its future. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate that. I think I very much agree with sort of your remarks about how while we're still currently in the lead, you've sort of laid out some serious threats in terms of manufacturing, need to maintain stellar workforce. I thought I'd turn to you now, Stephen, because policy plays a role. It can either help support growth and competitiveness in terms of manufacturing workforce, or it can hinder it. Give us, if you will, sort of the overview of the policy landscape and where you think the benefits can accrue in terms of what the government can do and challenges as well.
Sure. Well, thank you, Fallon, and to SI for the invitation to participate today. It's important because there's truly a battle being fought right now for leadership in what is the world's most important industry. an industry which through the digital technologies like AI and big data and cloud computing that it enables is foundational to the innovation and productivity capacity of every other industry of the economy, from the life sciences to advanced manufacturing to clean energy. As you said, the US leads the global semiconductor industry, and historically that leadership has rested on two key pillars. First, a ferociously innovative and R&D intensive private sector, which has been supported and enabled by an effective suite of enabling public policies. Among these have included historically robust federal funding for basic and applied scientific research, support for semiconductor technology development and road mapping activities through programs like Semitech or DARPA, market driving public procurement, especially from defense and national security industries, and policies that protect intellectual property, have supported the advent of global supply chains through trade liberalization, and of course, support for a high skilled talent base. But with the global digital economy now accounting for as much as 25% of the world's GDP, an increasing number of countries are trying to wrest semiconductor leadership from the United States and have enacted a series of comprehensive strategies to try to do so. If you look at China, they want to invest up to 1.4 trillion in semiconductor technology over the next decade as part of their national IC integrated circuit plan, as China seeks a closed loop semiconductor ecosystem where the country could be self-sufficient in all phases of semiconductor production, from design to fabrication to package assembly and test. And while it's fine for China to wish to be competitive in the sector, of course, a concern is that the country has openly declared a desire, a goal for its domestic suppliers to meet 70% of the nation's semiconductor needs by 2025 and to entirely eliminate imports of US semiconductors by 2035. It's fine when China or other countries wish to compete through enabling policies like investing in research and infrastructure and skills. It's not fine when they're turning to what I call innovation mercantilist policies that seek to either steal IP, close off access to their markets, or other policies that aren't fair competition in the global economy. Other countries, however, are responding with what we call more innovation supportive public policies. You look at Korea, for instance, last year, in 2019, they launched a new semiconductor competitiveness strategy that wants to make it a leader with $840 million of investment over the next 10 years in developing next generation semiconductor technologies and training 17,000 professionals. Europe has its electronics industrial strategy for Europe, as well as a new microelectronics IPCEI, or important project of common European interest. Semiconductors and information technologies figure prominently in the new Horizon Europe R&D funding package they've just unveiled for the next 7 years. Apart from that, according to the OECD, between 2014 and 2018, other nations, including Germany, Ireland, Israel, South Korea, and Taiwan, provided more than $50 billion to semiconductor firms to support construction of fabs in their countries. So in other words, international competition in semiconductors has significantly intensified over the past half decade. And if the US wants to remain a leader in both semiconductor innovation and manufacturing, it's time for redoubled investment and a coordinated public-private response. And that was the intent of recently introduced bipartisan legislation in the Senate, the Creating Helpful Incentives to Produce Semiconductors or CHIPS for America Act, introduced by Senators Cornyn and Warner, as well as the American Foundries Act of 2020, introduced by Senators Cotton and Schumer, which have since been combined and are now working their way through the NDAA, or National Defense Authorization Act process. And hopefully we'll get some movement on these packages in the months ahead. But collectively, what this legislation would do is expand federal investment in semiconductor research and technology developments, introduce incentives to locate semiconductor manufacturing facilities in the United States, and provide expanded tax credits for investment in the sector. Some of the specific proposals include providing $10 billion in matching grants for WTO-consistent state and local incentives to attract semiconductor manufacturing. That's important because it could level the playing field with the incentives that other nations provide. Investing $7 billion over 5 years for semiconductor research at agencies like the NSF, DOE, or DARPA. Creating a new Manufacturing USA Institute for Semiconductor Manufacturing, and launching a 40% investment tax credit for semiconductor equipment and facilities. Now, this is critically important for 4 key reasons. First, renewed federal investment would help to invest a yawning federal R&D underinvestment gap. In fact, if our government were to invest as much in R&D as a share of GDP as it did in the 1980s, we'd have to invest $100 billion more a year than we are doing today. In 2019, just $1.7 billion of federal R&D went to core semiconductor specific R&D activities, maybe another four for related activity, but we're underinvesting in federal R&D. Second, it's critical that we both be able to innovate and invent, but also manufacture here. That matters because semiconductors represent a high value added, high wage, export intensive industry whose health is indispensable from that of the overall US economy and employment. And of course, this industry is absolutely vital for American leadership in national security and defense. At the end of the day, the public policy response here is the test case for the future. It's up to American policymakers to ask, are we going to see the types of strategies other countries are implementing to get competitive in the sector, to try and take leadership for the US, and are we going to respond? Because that is going to be the key, as you say, John and Dan, to how we respond in AI, in 5G, in biotechnology, et cetera. The question for the United States is, are we going to understand that we have to maintain a high wage, high skill, technology-driven economy, or are we going to go down the path of other countries like England, who have historically not put in place the policies that were necessary to keep them competitive in this sector? So, Falon, thank you for the invitation to speak today. An effective public-private response is going to be critical if we're going to maintain American leadership in this critical industry.
Yeah, no, there's definitely a lot going on the policy front that I think is will play a critical role over the next few years. I do want to circle back. We do have some time for Q&A, about 10 more minutes. I think we have a couple. I will remind folks if they want to ask a question to hit the Q&A button or to raise your hand. I do want to just follow up with each of you on a sort of quick round of follow-up questions. John, in terms of the market, I wanted to ask, you know, the report does present some data on US industry market share, specifically by subproduct and by stages of production. I just want to get your thoughts on what specific segments, whether it's an end product or whether it's a a stage, or, fabless or or IDM, do you think the U.S. industry is well positioned to lead in, and where might there be weaknesses in where the market may go in terms of a subproduct or in terms of sort of the stage of production, and where the U.S. is currently positioned?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think Dan hit on some of this in his presentation. I mean, if you look at the holistic number, as you pointed out, US semis are slightly less than half of overall market share globally. If you exclude memory, I think that number jumps up to about 60%. But if you look at certain subsegments like MPUs today, GPUs today, FPGAs today, we're well north of 90% market share. And in my mind, the way I try to think of this vis-a-vis Stephen's comments about China's desire to domestically source over time is what areas of the semi market would it be easiest for China to break into? I mean, clearly a big brunt of their investments have gone towards memory. I would argue that NAND is probably an area that's easier to get into today than DRAM. And so I would look for them to become a bigger force in NAND over time than necessarily DRAM over time. I think given the importance of AI as a technology, there's a lot of investment going on in AI as well, and on sort of not general purpose compute as much as application specific compute inside of China. So I think that just given the national priority there, that will be an area where they will accelerate their efforts as well. Other than that, I mean, I would look to kind of the way I think about it is gross margins kind of dictate the breadth and depth of your moats. And so I would look at higher gross margin segments as being more difficult for China to break into, lower gross margin segments as easier. I think the real question here is what over time might the US government try to do to curtail China's desire to grow as a semiconductor company? Because as we all know on this call, there are several choke points that the US could pull, i.e. on the equipment side and on the EDA side, which would make life much more difficult, or make China's goal of attaining domestic sort of independence much more difficult. So I think a lot of this will be policy driven over the next 5+ years.
Great, cool. Dan, I wanted to follow up with you sort of a two-pronged question. Want to take advantage, you've been covering the industry for quite a while, and I think having that broad view is sort of, it would be really interesting to understand. How do you, I guess, help us put the state of the U.S. semiconductor industry today in historical context. How do you characterize its current leadership position versus 20 years ago, or certainly there was the existential threat back in the 80s with the rise of the Japanese industry. So help us put sort of the position in historical context, and specifically what I guess what John alluded to, and pretty much everyone, the threat of the growing Chinese domestic industry. How would you assess the viability of the Chinese being a serious global player, and do you have a timeline on that? I know there's been a lot of sort of views on sort of pessimistic views or more optimistic views on the development of the Chinese industry, but I'd love to get your thoughts.
Okay. Well, one, if we kind of rewind back to my point about World War II, because I'm guilty as everybody is running back to mama on the last cycle, but the thing that I find so interesting about today's environment is that similarity to the post-World War II environment, where you have lots of public partnerships, private-public partnerships to build highways out and things like that to support the auto industry, and also huge investments in universities and education. For the first time, it was the President Eisenhower, I believe, required that science be taught in every high school. Those sorts of things are really needed today, because we really, if you look at that pre-period, the 80s, 70s, there was a Japanese threat, and but the U.S. is amazingly resilient when we got out of that. And I think the rise of China is not, it can go either way. They're going to spend a lot of money. They're going to do what they're going to do. I think you have to look at today, and that is the strength of the United States since that period has been the massive globalization of the semiconductor industry, and the ability to rely on the strengths of all these people around the world. We're moving into an era where globalization is over, and so it looks a lot more like that post-World War II period, where the U.S. government was funding through the military, tremendous amounts of investment in semiconductor technology and trying to, get to the moon and goals like that, and be able to put satellites in space, be able to put digital cameras and have all the communication technologies, as opposed to, if you recall from the movie, some of the movies, like Ice Station Zebra, that they put film up there, and the satellites had to come down and the film had to be retrieved. Those were just major changes that occurred because of that public-private partnership. And if anything, we've seen in the last 4 years, the era of globalization is over, and the U.S. has to respond to that. It has to realize that strength may go away, and we have to have complete new policies around that and move towards a public-private partnership. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, definitely. Speaking of policy, Stephen, one thing that we've touched upon, which is perennially something that SIA advocates on behalf of, and sometimes we have, it's a good policy environment to make headway on this, and other times not, but is the workforce issue. It's key. We talk about it all the time. Our workers are the lifeblood at what sustain and lead to greater leadership. My question is, how would you, if you were sort of, you could run things for a day, you were king for a day, what kind of policies would you enact, ideal policies to promote the semiconductor workforce? We talk about immigration policy, and we talk about STEM at sort of very early age as sort of two components of critical components of that. How would you ideally formulate sort of policy to help promote the best way possible domestic domestic workforce?
Well, I think we need a National Defense Education Act that turns out many more American graduates in scientific fields, whether that's chemical, physical, biological sciences. One thing we need to do is expand the number of NSF PhD industrial fellows. We graduate about a third as many of them today as we did in the 1970s. We should give 20 million more to the NSF for its PhD industrial fellows program. We should invest more in the ATE, the Advanced Technical Education Program, out of NSF as well. A recent study by Brookings found that the United States is graduating 600,000 fewer computer science students per decade than we need in our economy if we're going to be able to take advantage of these tools like AI, right? So obviously you need a workforce that is capable of being at the cutting edge of semiconductor design and manufacturing processes. But we also need to think about the broader skilled workforce that's capable of effectively using these digital technologies to keep America in the lead across all the other sectors of the economy. They're going to have to take advantage and deploy these tools.
Great. We are getting close to the hour. We have a bunch of questions. If folks want to hang out for about 5 more minutes, I'm going to throw a few out and see if folks would like to, if the panelists would like to sort of answer any of these. Let me see. One question we got: why don't we want to invest in back-end production ATP here, presumably in the United States? And another question: what impacts will RISC-V have on the industry in the short, medium, and long term? And one other question I'll just throw out there, if folks are interested in picking up on them. To Stephen and John, what do you make of CHIPS AFA bills? Do you think they will be merged, and how likely is it that they'll end up in NDAA 2021, I think maybe 2020 or maybe 2021, and actually pass? So a policy question, a question about RISC-V, impact on the industry, and also a question on why no back-end production ATP here in the United States. Any of you folks want to jump into those? Maybe Dan, you want to look at, maybe talk about the ATP question?
The back end is, you know, the technology for core assembly manufacturing left the United States decades ago. It's highly labor intensive, and so it never really had a chance of coming back, despite lots of, you know, I can remember in the 80s, people were talking about bringing assembly back to the US. What's changed has been the advent of advanced packaging, which looks a lot more like the wafer fab. And you are seeing that come back in the United States in different ways. Or you're seeing all of the companies, whether it's, Intel's actually got a very strong position in that technology. Micron is using it through a lot of its suppliers. They're developing it. And whether, you know, we talk about NVIDIA, AMD, some of the really, you know, Qualcomm, some of the really great American fabless companies, they're all also going in this direction, using TSMC and Amkor, ASE's technology. So there is a possibility of it coming back in the United States. Most of the test programming, things like that, is still done in the United States. The software side of ATE is still done here. There's still, there's a fair amount of manufacturing of ATE systems and components here. So it's kind of a mixture of, you know, where do you want the weight to be? Do you want it to be an old technology? I don't think that's coming back. I don't think it can come back. We just don't have the skill sets anymore. The newer stuff, that's definitely coming back to the US.
Got you. Stephen, John, do you want to take a crack at the looking at the potential for the bills, CHIPS and AFA bills, and how they may play out over the next month or so?
Sure, I'll take a crack at that. Yeah, so my understanding is that the bills currently have been merged. They are working their way now through the NDAA process. So I do think that, yes, they will come to fruition when that package comes through Congress. The timing of that might be later in the summer, might be lame duck for elements of it. But I do think historically, I think what's changed is in the past, there might have been a coterie perhaps of Republican Congress members who would see activities like that as perhaps industrial policy, not a laissez-faire approach. I think you see increasing understanding on Capitol Hill from both sides of the aisle that China is a serious competitor, that we have to redouble investment in America's advanced technology industries. And when you see these bills being led on the Republican side by folks like Cotton and Cornyn and Rubio, there's now a coterie on both sides of the Republican aisle in the Senate, and I think in the House, that's going to push this legislation through.
Mm-hmm. Okay. John, any comments on bills, maybe how they may affect, or what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree and echo what Stephen said. I mean, I think you always have to be careful about presidential politics playing into what gets done, you know, between now and November and what doesn't. But clearly, you know, and Farhan, I'm sure that the SIA sees this as well. There's been growing bipartisan support for years now to understand how strategically important the semiconductor industry was. I mean, the way I think about it quite simply is in the 70s, the US government spent $15 billion for the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. And quite frankly, I think there's a strong argument to be made that silicon is much more strategic today than oil is. So I suspect that regardless of who ends up winning the White House in November, there's going to be continuity around this policy and enough bipartisan support that we'll see something in 2021. To just add to Dan's comments on the test and packaging, I couldn't agree more on some of the leading edge technologies. I think one of the things that people don't appreciate enough is that without 450 millimeter, the industry's facing a significant cost problem. And one of the ways they're trying to address that cost problem is there's things like tile strategy, chiplet strategies. But those are only made possible if you have that advanced packaging. And to Dan's point, I don't think there's been a lot of investment here in the US because it's labor intensive and also because of where the supply chain resides for manufacturing of electronic goods. I think if there's political will to bring, you know, broad-based manufacturing back to the US, at least modestly, that could actually open up an opportunity for more test and assembly being done, if not domestically in the US, perhaps in North America, a la Mexico or the like.
Gotcha.
I'd like to say something on that too, and that is the understanding of Washington today is miles ahead of where it was, you know, the last decade or so. I remember the 80s when the head of the economics group at the White House made the comment that there was no difference between computer chips and potato chips.
Yes.
You know? and true story, Andy Grove sent him a violin and said, with a note that said, "Fiddle on this while Silicon Valley burns." You know, today they really do understand the threat, and also I think they comprehend on a level the importance of the global open markets to the U.S. semiconductor industry, but at the same time want to make sure that that interest in global markets, we don't secede the American interest in having a leadership in semiconductor technology.
Yeah, no, that's a really important historical perspective. I appreciate that. And obviously SIA has been working to try to, you know, to underscore the importance, as all of you have mentioned, of this industry to the global economy, to the U.S. You know, economic.
Great job too.
Appreciate that. And obviously defense, as you had mentioned, Stephen. Well, we're 5 past the hour. I really appreciate you taking the extra time. We have a bunch of other questions, and I'm sure we could spend another hour or two talking about the state of the U.S. semiconductor industry and where we're going. But we're going to have to call it now. So Dan Hutchison, VLSI Research, Stephen Ezell, ITIF, John Pitzer, Credit Suisse, really appreciate your time. And thank you very much for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you.